Good evening, football fans. Welcome to a very special edition of Sports Crunch with DKROM. And tonight we begin our fantasy football fix edition of the show. And we couldn't have asked for a more perfect guest to join us for the first edition of this installment. Mr. Evan Silva has been the senior editor of the world-renowned fantasy football website rotoworld.com, and he is arguably he is my favorite fantasy football analyst out there, because he takes you beyond the numbers. He's a guy that knows his X's and O's and how to watch players on film. He knows how to interpret scheme, the strength of NFL rosters, the NFL draft prospects, you name it. He gives you the whole picture, which is essential in building a fantasy football team that will take you to the top. And before I introduce him, please purchase their 2050 draft guide. You can get it at your local Barnes & Noble or wherever. Look for it. It's very helpful. And enough of that. It's a pleasure to welcome the great Evan Silva to the show. What's going on, Evan?
What's up, man? I'm doing well. We had the opportunity to meet not too long ago at Skokie Library.
Yes, sir.
I hope that the presentation was all right, and it was good to meet you, man.
It was amazing to meet you too as well, Evan, and the presentation was ace indeed, Evan. You gave me a lot of helpful tips to proceed with my fantasy drafts, and I have one exactly 3 weeks from tonight, one of three.
David, you're being nice, man. You already knew all that stuff that we talked about.
I try hard, but you just give me the bigger picture. You added those key extra details is my point. And the first question I want to ask you is, after observing week one of preseason action, based on the performances on the field and the developments off the field, obviously, what players after this week one of preseason action, whose stock has gone up in your view, and whose stock has gone down?
Well, I definitely think that Amir Abdullah, at least his ADP, will definitely start to soar. I was in an MFL 10 today, and he went early third round. And I was not seeing him go. Maybe the earliest I'd seen him go, and I'm doing these constantly, is like maybe 4.6 or 4.7. So to see him go early third today, that's because of what happened in the first preseason game, and that's where he showed his dynamic playmaking ability, his ability to create yardage on his own. We talk about some RBs that get what's blocked, like Ben Jarvis, Green Ellis. Joick Bell is really like that. Eddie Lacy, I think, gets you that and a little bit more. And then Amir Abdullah can turn what should be a short gain or even a loss sometimes into a positive or into a big gain, and that's a special ability. Now, we have to find out about Amir Abdullah and whether he can be a full-time back, because sometimes these smaller backs tend to struggle when given high workloads. We've seen that with C.J. Spiller. We saw that last year with Andre Ellington. We saw that with Giovanni Bernard. We have to see if he can be a Ray Rice sort of player. But absolutely his stock rose. Now, Joick Bell, of course, he's going to be back at some point. He's going to be the Lions' goal line back. So are you willing to pay an early third for a guy who probably isn't going to score a lot of touchdowns?
That's a very good point, Evan. I personally wouldn't, and which kind of segues into this question I had for you. Like you mentioned, like when you're targeting running backs in your fantasy drafts, that you target a running back on a good offense and a running back who's going to get the touches in the goal line and in the red zone. Because touchdowns are the great equalizer when you play fantasy football, folks. And but at a certain point in fantasy drafts, you reach a dilemma where you are looking at guys like C.J. Spiller, who I can think have a Darren Sproles-esque type campaign with the Saints as long as he's healthy, and guys like Latavius Murray and T.J. Yeldon, two potential workhorses, but on two potentially low-scoring offenses. So on the bad offense, who is going to get the goal line touches, or the running back on the good offense, who is not going to score a lot of the touchdowns?
You're exactly right that's a dilemma, and it starts to appear in like the fourth and fifth rounds usually. again, Andre Ellington could very well be like that. They didn't like to use him in red zone situations very much last year, and the Cardinals already declared Robert Hughes, the fullback, their short yardage back. But people will look at the first preseason game, and Andre Ellington scored a 2-yard TD. So you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But he has that dilemma, and as does CJ Spiller. Although like you said, at least before his injury, I was looking at him as a guy who might compete to lead the NFL among running backs in catches. So at his peak, CJ Spiller's catching a lot more passes this year than Amir Abdullah is. So is Amir Abdullah going to catch 40 catches would be probably a pretty good year for a rookie, and I love him, and I've loved to take him in the 5th round to this point, but I think I'm going to be out if he starts going early 3rd. And like I said, he started to today.
Most definitely, and also a variable that I believe a lot of Amir Abdullah lovers, myself included. I'm taking this into account now, is the complicated situation of the Joe Lombardi offense, because Lombardi loves a round robin in the backfield, if you know what I mean.
That too, right?
And that is another red flag that people who are hopping on the Amir Abdullah trade should pay close attention to.
Yeah.
And absolutely. And now let's you mentioned Andre Ellington and the Cardinal situation. It was reported just about an hour or so ago by NFL insider Jay Glazer of Fox Sports that Chris Johnson, yes, that Chris Johnson, formerly the Titans and the Jets, who's obviously fallen off the wagon since his historic 2009 campaign, has agreed to terms with the Cardinals. That there's been a lot of Twitter spat over how does this affect Andre Ellington and David Johnson, who some people are targeting in the late rounds. And I'm a David Johnson guy myself. But what is your spin on the situation, Evan?
I think that the Cardinals are telling us what they think. They know that they need more than one back. We saw what happened to Andre Ellington. It wasn't just a foot injury before last season. He ended up on injured reserve listed with hip and sports hernia injuries as well. He averaged under 3.3 yards per carry. He was abysmal on the ground. They pulled him at in the red zone. So it's not like they're unaware of his size limitations. They know of them, and they saw how he performed when he was given a big workload last year. And now they're going out and they're adding to their backfield. They saw Andre Ellington miss a week of camp with a hamstring injury. They went out and signed Chris Johnson. They had used a 3rd round pick on David Johnson. So, I remember when Arian said 20 touches a game for Ellington this year. That happened early in camp, and everybody was like, some people were like, "Oh, if he hits, he's gonna win you your league," And that's still true, but the odds of him hitting like that are really, really, really low, really low. And also on Sports Injury Predictor, they have him as the most likely running back in the entire NFL to get injured this year. So. Lot of red flags, man.
Totally agree. I'm avoiding Andre Ellington myself as well. Like, I hesitate whenever he pops up on screen in a mock. I just avoid him altogether, and I hope his others are following suit. So And now let's move on to the wide receiver position. And at that Skokie Library presentation of yours that I attended a week ago, you said that there are about 8 surefire wide receiver ones that are going to get a monster load of targets. In your view, who are those 8 wide receivers, and how does the pool look after those 8?
Okay, hang on. I got to pull it up, David.
No problem, Evan. Take your time.
All right. I just don't want to miss anybody,
Yep, of course.
Okay, so Julio Jones, Des Bryant, Antonio Brown, Demaryius Thomas, C.J. Anderson, Odell Beckham, Calvin Johnson, A.J. Green.
C.J. Anderson's a running back.
I would put the cutoff probably at 7, and then I think there's a little mini tier there with with A.J. Green, Alshon Jeffrey, Mike Evans, and then into Hilton and Cobb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned You mentioned C.J. Anderson, but he's a running back. So who are those? So you said 7 receivers again. Once again, Antonio, Julio, Dez, Antonio, Demarius, Beckham, and Megatron. And who was the 7th again?
Jordy.
Oh, Jordy Nelson. Yeah.
Yep.
Makes sense. So those were your 7 receivers, and had good description of the rest. And if you don't nab one of those 8 receivers, or one of those 7, which one of the next ones would you consider the most? That would help you the most.
Yeah, so obviously AJ Green and Alshon Jeffrey. I mean, you could very well argue that both of them belong in that first tier anyway. Mike Evans absolutely can get there. There are obviously more reasons for caution on him, but he absolutely can get there, and that's why he's ranked high, is because of his upside. T.Y. Hilton, still has that on-field relationship with Andrew Luck, and that goes a long way. Randall Cobb. And then I really like DeAndre Hopkins. He's still a guy who's really affordable in drafts. Hasn't really shown it. Although he pretty much did show it last year, but hasn't shown quite the ability to be a wide receiver 1 yet. Last year he was a borderline wide receiver 1 as the number 2 target on his own team. So you look at the upside of targets there. You take away Arian Foster, that team is going to have to lean on DeAndre Hopkins to move the chains, and especially in the passing game, where their secondary weapons are C.J. Fedorowicz and Garrett Graham, and Nate Washington and Cecil Shorts, and maybe the kid Jalen Strong. So he should be. DeAndre Hopkins should compete for the NFL lead in targets this year.
That's a very interesting reason to pick DeAndre Hopkins, although another a point against drafting DeAndre Hopkins that I've heard a lot of colleagues in your circles, in the fantasy analysis circles, say is that because when you draft a wide receiver, you're essentially drafting a quarterback too. And because the Houston Texans have arguably one of the 2 or 3 worst quarterback or unproven quarterback situations in the league, with either Ryan Mallett or Brian Hoyer.
That's right.
So there is some risk involved. So
I agree with that. The thing though is that I think that volume could offset some of the inefficiency. That's sort of what I would be betting on.
Oh, most definitely.
But then he disappoints if he doesn't get that volume. But to me, I think he's a good bet to get that volume.
Oh, me too, because they're going to need to open up the passing game more than likely, especially with Arian Foster's health, as you mentioned. So Hopkins, definitely around the 4th or 5th round, could be a good buy, as you suggested. And moving on to the quarterback position, and just like you, I am a huge proponent of advising people who ask me to wait on their quarterbacks. And my question is, though, at what round, at the earliest, what is the earliest possible round you would consider selecting a quarterback?
Oh, I would consider all over the place. I'm definitely not only draft late quarterback. I've taken Andrew Luck or Aaron Rodgers in the 4th round and a couple of MFL 10s. Obviously, if Andrew Luck, I've considered Andrew Luck late in the 3rd round. He usually just goes right before me. Russell Wilson, I think he could have a huge year with Jimmy Graham there. I would start thinking about him in the 6th. And yeah, those are the early quarterbacks I'd be looking at. And you'll sometimes see Peyton Manning slip into the 7th and 8th, and then Ben Roethlisberger, if he gets to the late 8th or 9th round, I like those guys in that range. Otherwise, we're going Eli or Rivers or
Tannehill.
Yeah, we're going with a guy in the double-digit rounds.
I completely agree. All those final 3 guys that you just mentioned are 3 guys that I would love to have that late. And I hear Tony Romo is also going that late too. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, he goes in that same range with those other guys. Matt Ryan, for some odd reason, goes way ahead of that group of quarterbacks. It's so weird to me, but people love Matt Ryan for some reason.
Yeah, I was guilty as charged.
He looks the part. He looks the part.
Yeah, he sure does look the part, but I picked him in the 7th round in one of my leagues last year. Thank God I got Rivers in the 12th. That saved me. So So that's so it's better to wait till those late rounds is the moral of that story. And and two more questions before we're out of time. At all the skill positions, name one player who you think is too overvalued and a player you think is too undervalued.
Okay, so let's hit quarterbacks first. I think that Eli is undervalued. They play a fast-paced offense. He's got a big time wide receiver one in Odell Beckham. He's got a big red zone monster in Larry Donnell. He's got Ruben Randall, who hopefully he takes another step forward this year. He did have over 70 catches and over 900 yards last season. I agree that it was a disappointment, and they got Victor Cruz coming back, and I don't think that Victor Cruz is going to be like a lid popping vertical threat anymore. But I think that he could help them maybe as a possession receiver in the slot. So lot of good things to a lot of things to like about Eli Manning. A guy who is overvalued, Matt Ryan. Look at his supporting cast right now. It's awful beyond Julio Jones. This is why Julio Jones is going to get the ball so much this year. Jacob Tamme and 34-year-old Roddy White, who has a bulky knee and has been really banged up for the last 2 seasons running. So that's my overvalued and undervalued at quarterback.
What about overvalued, undervalued running back?
Overvalued at running back. Let's go with Andre Ellington. Again, the Cardinals are telling us what they think about Andre Ellington, and you can choose to hide your eyes or hide under a rock, but Andre Ellington isn't going to get 20 touches per game again this year. He isn't going to score touchdowns this year, and he's probably going to still end up getting hurt. So he's a bad bet, I think.
Yeah, sure. And who is undervalued in terms of running backs?
Chris Ivory. The Jets have discussed the possibility of using him as an every down back, and I don't know if that's going to work out, but I do know that he's going to be a heavily utilized, very clear-cut lead back in an offense that I think could surprise some people. They're gonna spread the field, man, with all those wideouts: Devin Smith, Marshall Decker, Curley, Quincy Enunwa, who got some love today, yeah, I think that he is undervalued at RB.
A very good point, especially since Ryan Fitzpatrick has been helped by a lot of good running backs in previous seasons, especially with Chad Gailey, with Fred Jackson and C.J. Spiller in Buffalo. Those guys produced pretty healthy amounts with Fitzpatrick at the helm, and there's no reason why Ivory cannot do the same in that same system as you alluded to. And overvalued, undervalued wide receiver.
Undervalued, I think, is Mike Wallace, and I'm very much a fan of Charles Johnson, but Charles Johnson has really showed nothing, to this point in his career. And would it really surprise you if he had a season where he caught, 54 balls for 780 yards and 5 touchdowns? Like that would be like not a bad year. This is like really his first full season in the NFL. And I could definitely see him having just a year like that. And people consider that progress for him. But he disappoints a lot of people in fantasy in the process because those numbers would not be good enough. Mike Wallace has been a top 25 fantasy receiver in 5 straight seasons. And he's a great pick this year. You can often get him 8th round. And he's an every week starter, I think.
I completely agree. I think he's going to do a lot better with Teddy Bridgewater than he did with Ryan Tannehill. And he caught 10 touchdowns from Ryan Tannehill last year. And
yeah, he was the wide receiver 18, so he was like a mid-range wide receiver 2.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And I honestly want to add that I think Teddy Bridgewater's deep ball accuracy is a million times better than Ryan Tannehill's, and I think that's going to help Wallace tremendously improve his yardage numbers.
I dig it.
Yeah. And finally, overvalued, undervalued tight end, arguably the thinnest position in fantasy.
Ooh, Travis Kelce's getting awfully close to overvalued, I think, And I mean, I love the guy, but I took him late 4th round in a draft today, but I wouldn't do that. Was in an MFL 10. I wouldn't do that in a redraft league. JJ at late round QB has shown that tight end is a fairly replaceable position. Not as much as quarterback, but you can definitely be competitive trying to grab streamers off the waiver wire. And he's probably going to be the 1B to Jeremy Macklin's 1A in an offense where they don't throw a lot. I mean, they played slow and they didn't throw the ball very much last year. Maybe they'll pick up the tempo a little bit this year. That would help for sure. How many touchdowns is he going to score? That seems like a low scoring offense to me, and I don't know. I think 8 touchdowns would be like a really good year for him, but I feel like that's going to be a little tough for him to get to, number one, and number two, 8 touchdowns really that wouldn't tilt Kelsey for you to the point where he's really giving you a weekly advantage. I don't think Kelsey's going to give you a real weekly advantage. He'll have his share of good games, but I don't think he's a difference maker for you.
Neither do I, especially with check down Alex at quarterback, and
right. He loves targeting Anthony Sherman, the fullback.
He most certainly does, and he even does that when there's a wide receiver wide open. It's a problem.
I know. Chris Conley, man, that kid runs like 4.3. Poor kid is going to be so wide open downfield, and little Alex just going to dump it to DeAnthony Thomas for a 2-yard gain.
That's probably true, and our final. Good point, Evan. I completely agree. As a Broncos fan, I definitely concur. So,
right.
So our final question of the evening is this. And by the way, I thank you once again for donating your time and your incredible mind to our program this evening. And the final question is, you obviously mentioned last week that it's dangerous to not rely on a single stat or statistical category. But if there was one crucially important statistical category for people to keep at the front of their minds when they're drafting, which one is it and why?
I mean, I would just go with real simple answers on this, I would say, like for running backs, I would be thinking about touchdowns. I would be thinking about touchdowns for everybody. I mean, honestly, I would address people differently. I don't know. This is actually a much tougher question than I thought it would be at first. I would be thinking about touchdowns, man. I really would. And in some cases, I would be thinking about receptions for running backs, especially if it's PPR, because Rich Rebar has shown that catches for wide receivers don't tilt things as much as catches for running backs do. Because everybody gets that bump, at wide receiver, and everybody gets that bump too for running backs, of course, gets that 1-point bump. But when a guy catches 70 balls and, there are other guys he's competing with guys who are catching 25 balls, that's a monster edge,
Yeah.
And, guys who are catching 25 balls and play wide receiver, they're on the waiver wire all year, but there are running backs that are catching 25 balls that are legit every week starters.
Most definitely. And another category that you brought up that caught my attention last week was like the amount of snaps a team runs in a given season. How much value would you give to that when you go to your draft?
I mean, I think that should be built into your analysis, built into what are your expectations for the offense, and thus, what are your expectations for how many times they're going to throw to their running back, because if they have higher play volume, we're definitely looking at guys and boosting up guys who play in offenses with higher play volume. That's why I kind of think that both Rashad Jennings and Shane Vereen can have value in the same week this year, in the same season, and they can both be worthwhile flex plays. Rashad Jennings might even be an RB2 if he can hold off Andre Williams. Shane Vereen should be an every week flex play in PPR leagues this season, I think.
That wouldn't surprise me either. And Evan, that does it. That does it for our show tonight, folks. And thank you, Evan, once again for donating your amazing talent and with your amazing insight and some incredible information tonight. And before we part, I want to give a chance for our listeners to hear you and where we can find your work online or on the airwaves.
Yeah, of course. You can read what I write at rotoworld.com. You can listen to the Fantasy Feast podcast with Ross Tucker, and that's that you can find me on Twitter at Evan Silva.
Ladies and gentlemen, Evan Silva, a man of amazing fantasy football analysis with every possible little detail of the book. He is very helpful, and we were so blessed to have him join us this evening. And I believe whoever watches this episode is going to win a fantasy championship because of the amazing mind of Evan Silva. We thank you once again, Evan, and I definitely hope to do this sometime soon. Again,
we will. Thank you, David.
My pleasure. Thank you again, Evan. And that does it for tonight's edition of Fantasy Football Fix here on Sports Crunch with DKROM. And tomorrow we continue our Fantasy Football Fix with Jim Sarantias of thefantasygreek.com. For Evan Silva, and I'm David Cromwell. Thank you so much for watching. Good night, everybody, and study hard for your drafts.